So we are live. Good afternoon, evening. I don't know where people are, but anyway. So today this is the third edition of the editorial talk of Orinoco Tribune team. Today's topic will be the just concluded first round of the presidential elections in Colombia, as well as we'll discuss more about it, like the situation, the background, a bit of history, and speculate a bit about the future. So today we have with us, like, apart from myself, Steve, and Jesus, our editor, we have with us a very special guest, Camila Escalante from Bolivia. She is the editor of Kawsachun News. I mean, those who do not follow it, please do, because they report from all over Latin America, not just from Bolivia. There is a lot of good content from Bolivia itself, but from everywhere. I recommend it. And within the next 2 months or 3 months, they will be also reporting a lot from Brazil, as the presidential election is coming up in that country also. Anyway, so with that things out of the way, we would jump right into this meeting, like today's meeting. So first, we are just going to set the stage discussing what happened on Sunday, May 29th, when the presidential election, or rather we say the first round, because no candidate reached 50% and could end it in the first round. So what we already know that there are two candidates who are passing into the second round, and there was like 54% participation, voter participation in the election, etc. So we will start with Jesus, asking him to set the stage, talk about the presidential election, in what situation it was held, because the moment we think of Colombia, we think of violence. So how that was in the run up to the presidential election, how the campaigns were held, as well as what happened last month, April, in the legislative election also. So Jesus, please talk about the general situation.
Yes, thank you, Sahili. And thank you, Camila, for accepting the invitation to join us. I know that you have followed the events in Colombia as well as us. I mean, so basically, what I want to mention in this part of the debate is what I want to talk about is about how the whole campaign, the presidential race evolve, and how we see that from Venezuela. I mean, in our case here in Venezuela, we are always bombarded with information about Colombia, good or bad, uh, and uh, and and that's because Colombia and Venezuela are basically the same country. The problem is that the Colombian oligarchy has been always playing in the opposite direction. So, but and in that work that they are doing about the, about mm, about splitting our countries, they has been convinced and get in the dark a big chunk of the Colombian population that now are apathic to politics or joining right-wing forces. So anyway, I mean, going back to the elections, as we saw last Sunday, Gustavo Petro didn't make it. I mean, he couldn't get the 50% needed in order to win in the first round. And a lot of us, even in my personal case, that I see Petro not like the best, the optimal, leftist candidate. I was hoping that he might win and get the 50% needed in order to avoid a second round, but that didn't happen. And some people in Colombia present that like a defeat for the progressive movement in Colombia, for the people supporting Petro. I don't see it that way. I believe that Petro still have chances, but some people in Colombia are doing some math and adding the votes that Federico got, and the votes that the other guy Gutierrez is his name, right?
No,
Uh,
Rodolfo
no,
Hernandez.
Hernández.
Hernandez, exactly. The vote for this, the guy that arrived in second place got, and they are doing this math, making people believe that those things can be added automatically. And the truth is that that is not like that. I mean, a lot of people that will face the polarization. I mean, in the second round, they will have to choose between Petro representing a change, and this guy Hernandez representing if you ask me, the continuation of the status quo, representing the oligarchy, the Colombian oligarchy interest. And I believe that in that scenario, it's not going to be easy for Petro to win, but there's a chance for, if you ask me, for him to win, especially if you ask me, because of the automatic endorsement that Federico Gutiérrez is his last name, right? Federico Gutiérrez gave to Hernandez immediately after the results of the elections were announced. So I believe that that showed a lot of people how the two candidacies from the right are interconnected. So anyway, I mean, that's my take on that, endorsement that happened on Sunday night in Bogota. And what else I wanna mention? The campaign was pretty bumpy. I mean, with a lot of accusations and denunciations of death threats. And all of us saw how in a lot of political rallies, campaign rallies, either Petro or Francia Marquez were like surrounded by bodyguards with armors and everything, which is very weird and shows how fragile the Colombian so-called democracy is. So I really don't know how that will, uh, play in the second round. But I also wanted to mention that also in the campaign, I noticed, especially from the Telesur coverage that did an excellent work, if you ask me, in the days before the election, I noticed that the campaign was, I mean, especially between Federico and Petro, was too confrontational, to the point that that a lot of the discussions about the most important issues was put aside, and they were just confronting in the not very constructive way. That's my impression from what I saw, from what I read. So, and that's not good, because you are not competing for programs, but for feelings, and that's not new. I mean, that has been happening everywhere in recent, not only Latin America, around the world, in recent, maybe for the last decade or so, or 1 or 2 decades. But anyway, I believe that it's important to go back to the programs, because it's where you show if you are really, promoting a change or something like that. So I want to stop it there to avoid talking too much and let the other compass speak, and I will go back if something come up.
Okay, thank you, Jesus, for that breakdown. So just for specifics, since Jesus were talking about maths, Petro's campaign got 8.5 million votes, a little more than 8.5 million votes, where if you add the votes of both the second place candidates, Rodolfo Hernández, and the third place one, Federico Gutiérrez, you get some 11 million votes. So that's a difference that Petro will need to cover and cross in order to be able to win in the second round, if everybody from Gutierrez's side, or who voted for Gutierrez, end up voting for Hernandez, which never really happens, because we have to take into account that generally in the second round there are less number of people voting everywhere. So that's a general trend. Then many people who are more extremist might not vote for Hernandez, though we'll talk about it a bit later. Now I will just come to Steve and ask you to describe a bit about how the electoral process works in Colombia, because we have heard a lot of complaints about adulteration of the results from different voting tables and stuff like that. So how does the electoral system work there, and why is it that there are always so many accusations and complaints of fraud? So Steve.
Well, yeah, that's it. Maybe I'll speak a little bit from a sort of global north perspective. A lot of people in the global north or the west or whatever you want to call it, we just read a little bit about Colombia's elections and maybe we assume that they happen like the elections here. I'm speaking from Canada, so the more and more we read and learn about Colombia's elections, we learn that it's a very different environment. In the U.S., they did have allegations of fraud last time around there. Donald Trump saying that he had been robbed of the election. In Colombia, this is sadly par for the course for basically every candidate. For as many years as I could go back and look, that there were accusations of various types of, let's say, irregularities during the voting process. These include vote buying, which, as it indicates, is people being paid to vote for a certain party. Also, threats of violence at the polls, threats of violence prior to the polls, killings. I mean, this is a place where social leaders are assassinated, where massacres happen with frightening regularity, where the paramilitaries wield an oppressive power over huge amounts of the population, so that the candidates that are backed by the paramilitaries, the narco traffickers, people get a pretty clear idea that if they don't go out and vote for these candidates, their families might be killed. They might be marked for death, or their lives might be ruined forever. They might be shunned by all their friends and colleagues just for exhibiting support for, a progressive candidate like Petro in this case. And that goes all the way through the municipal elections, the congressional parliamentary elections, as well as these presidential elections. I think 54% was the turnout for this election, which within Colombia, people were very happy about that. They were saying it was the highest turnout they've had in 20 years. So the mainstream media that I've read at least rarely reports on these very low turnout rates. The turnout itself, I think, indicates, you'll read two opinions. One, that people have given up hope in the electoral process, and that's why no one bothers to vote anymore. And secondly, that people are intimidated from voting, especially in rural areas that are controlled by paramilitaries, that they just stay away from the polling stations because they might get in trouble for going there and expressing, their true democratic desires. So I think it's probably a combination of both of those things that influences people not to vote. That's just the beginning of the irregularities. We could also get into the vote counting business, and Shahali, maybe you could fill in some details for us also. But just in the parliamentary vote of a month ago, there were 500 to 700,000 votes that were lost or miscounted, that were basically all for, or many of them at least, for Gustavo Petro's historic pact party. So, but it was not only Petro that was accusing the Democratic, let's say right-wing various parties, or the ones that controlled the electoral authorities. It was not only him that was accusing the system of irregularities and a miscount. It was also the opposition that was as well making accusations that there had been a fraud that had gone the other way that had benefited Petro. So, people in the US are maybe used to this a little bit, this idea that there's going to be all sorts of accusations launched by each side. In that kind of environment, personally, I think it's a little bit optimistic or naive to think that the results that we're reading about, where Petro received 40% and Hernandez received 28%, it's a little bit naive to think that these really reflect the will of the Colombian people. I think it's very naive. And if anyone thought, that Petro was a nice idea to think that Petro could win in the first round, it really was. I'm sure a lot of us hoped that it would happen. For me personally, the more I was, reading about this and following the elections and listening to interviews, reading firsthand accounts from people living through the violence in Colombia, the more I started myself to give up hope and to think, no, this isn't going to end in the first round. This is going to go into a second round, and in the second round, it's going to be very difficult for Petro to win. So and that's where we are now. And I think it was David Escobar that we interviewed that started speaking about this too. And it was interesting because he basically said that Petro has to win in the first round or else we're in trouble. But I saw a live stream of him on election day, and this goes back to what you were saying, Jesus. Like, he was really happy, and he was down there. I can't remember now which city he was in, but everyone was dancing and overjoyed. And it is a huge victory that Petro has won in the first round, even if he's not going to win the presidency, even considering all these things we've said about the will of the people not being represented. It's still a huge victory for him to win. And the fact that Hernandez was the runner-up, because Hernandez does represent sort of, in a sense, Jesus, like you're saying, he represents the status quo, but I think there's also a big argument that he also represents a change, as much as he's in that sense a Trump figure, that he represents a change from the status quo. He wasn't overtly endorsed by all the mainstream right-wing parties who all gathered to endorse Gutierrez. On the contrary, so like Petro said, this electoral victory represents a condemnation of Duque's government and of the status quo. So I think we have to recognize too that Colombians are, overjoyed and inspired in a lot of ways by these results.
Okay, thanks a lot, Steve, for all this description. And yes, it's true that there was a lot of violence because in many cases people could not go out to vote, as you said. I heard from someone from in the past talking about it, that there were like that ELN and as well as the FARC dissidents had declared ceasefire before the election and said that they wanted people to vote. On the other hand, there were the right-wing paramilitaries, and there are also right-wing armed groups that had not declared it. So there was a lot of violence in a lot of places. And I believe that there were 521 municipalities that were in extreme risk or high risk, according to the registrar, that is the highest authority on the elections. So that's something to take into account, that it wasn't 40% and 28% and 23 point something percent for Gutierrez did not really reflect everybody's will, because everybody wasn't even there, only 54%. Now, Camila, I will come to you because Kawsachun News, just after the election, published an article giving us a profile of the second place candidate, Rodolfo Hernández. So who is this person of whom we had not heard much, who wasn't doing much of a campaign in the streets, and yet over the last 2 weeks of the electoral campaign, his numbers rose rapidly, and we see him now in the second round, and some people are even adding up the numbers and saying that he is going to become the next president. So what sort of changes or what sort of status quo is he? And at the same time, could you also compare his background with that of Petro?
Yeah, so first I'll break some news here. Right now, the Pacto Histórico is live with Luis Gilberto Murillo, who was the vice presidential candidate with Sergio Fajardo, and he has gone with the Pacto Histórico and is endorsing them. He is the former Minister of the Environment and the former governor of the Chocó, and he's an academic. He is a Black Colombian, and of course, Sergio Fajardo said on the night of the election that he thinks that everybody should go with the way they want to vote. I think that's a very unfortunate position, but we're only talking about the fourth place ticket having only received 800,000 votes. So it's not a huge endorsement, but it's very important when we look at how close the second round is going to be. So that vice presidential candidate has decided not to, just leave it to voters, but to say that he is going with Gustavo Petro, which is very good news for the left. Yeah, we did post that article about Rodolfo. We've heard several criticisms by the Pacto Histórico, by Gustavo Petro in his speech on Sunday night about Rodolfo Hernández, saying that, this guy is just running on his sort of TikToking marketing strategy, that he has no platform, no policy proposals, and no program, except for the sort of default program, which is, continuing to, follow in that partnership with the United States and the sort of policies and programs that the United States has prescribed for Colombia that it has been implementing for so many years now. So we're going to see a continuation of, this sort of default to neoliberalism and US hegemony in Colombia, and, Colombia acting as a satellite state. He's an engineer, he's a construction magnate. And of course, people, I think like you guys have said, have compared this Rodolfo to Trump, to Bolsonaro, but also to Nayib Bukele, I guess because of his, PR tactics and not taking, any of this seriously. And he was also a mayor. I think, one of the things that he's been accused of corruption. He's the only one within the presidential candidates, in that first round that was formally involved in a corruption case. And he, his party is supposed to be the anti-corruption party. His corruption case had to do with a multi-million-dollar corruption scandal regarding the contracting of garbage services where he was mayor. And this is something that FICO pointed out. FICO, who's now Federico, the third place candidate, who's actually now formally endorsed Hernandez, as you guys said, he endorsed him on Sunday night, was actually the main person in more than one, at least two debates that I saw, that was actually accusing him, of Rodolfo Hernandez, of being the only corrupt person among the bunch. And, saying that, none of us have had anything to do with corruption, but your name has come up. How are you being, the authority to talk about corruption in this country? And ironically, of course, he handed him that endorsement on, just right after the pre-count was announced by the authorities there in Colombia. So, beyond the third place candidate who granted his support and endorsement in the second round of this right-wing candidate, we've also seen all the other main right-wing figures in the country immediately come out on Sunday night. They already knew that this was, as many analysts in Colombia have said, Uribismo's plan C. They're saying that this was already going to be the plan, that whoever was going to go to the second round, if they were to make it to the second round, who wasn't Petro, was going to have all the support of all of the Colombian oligarchy, all of the right wing and far right that is most closely aligned with the United States and with obviously the Venezuelan far right. And so it was no question for them. And it does represent a huge threat. I've heard from, right after we began to hear those non-binding pre-count votes on Sunday night, we heard from some of the, one of the leaders of the CLOC Via Campesina, which is the largest social movement in the world, which is the global peasants movement. And one of the very important leaders, her name is Nuri, and she's from a rural movement there. And she said that this was, absolutely a very sad development, that given all of their efforts to try to get Petro to win in the first round, that this failure to win, given all of the polls, given all of the mobilizations we've seen in recent years against the Duque regime, that it's absolutely, not only, sad, but it's actually scary because of all of these extensive efforts. And, she expressed that, all the right and, far right actors have already declared their support. And, I did sense a little bit of just concern. And I think that unfortunately, if you're following the politicians online and their social media and on Twitter, there's a lot of people saying, including Petro himself during his speech on Sunday night, that we only need 1 million more votes. Unfortunately, some people have calculated that they might need a little bit more than that. And we've yet to see, the ways in which the media is going to maneuver in the information war and the sorts of attack campaigns that will be waged now, the information that's going to be released between now and June 19th. And so I do think that it's a very tricky position that Gustavo Petro finds himself in right now, especially because there's going to be some sectors of the right and the media that are going to try to convince people who are against Alvaro Uribe, they're against Ivan Duque, they're going to convince them that this candidate is not as bad as the right and not the left, for anyone who's against communism and who's against Venezuela and Nicolas Maduro, that this is some sort of third way or something like that, or some sort of independent centrist candidate. And that is just absolutely reprehensible and just unbelievable that people would fall into that trap. But the media campaign is very strong there.
Thanks a lot, Camila. That's really a concerning development, really. And this also reminds me of what happened in Ecuador last year. The candidate, Andres Arauz, who was in the first place in the first round, had some 10% over the second place candidate, who is also a very corrupt man. He finally, Arauz could not make it to the presidency, and a person against whom there are cases of corruption, cases of in the Latin American region, that this sort of thing happens. So that's really sad. So we will remain in this theme, but broaden this a bit, and we'll take a bit of a look at history, and we'll start with Steve. This is a country, Colombia is a country which has one of the longest running armed conflicts in the world, more than 7 decades. And I remember that you had written some stuff, like some articles about Gaitan being murdered during the presidential campaign. And since then, the country has been in they call it a low intensity civil war, but it's neither very low intensity nor very civil. Even in this year, 79 social leaders have been murdered just in 2022, whatever has gone this year, and since 2016, after the signing of the peace accords with FARC, I think more than 315 or something signatories have been murdered in that country, and most of them, over 200 of them, during the time of Duque. So it's a very violent place to be. So the violence did not start today, right? The violence started more than 7 decades ago. So I would ask you just to, I know it's a very difficult question, but just tell us how we arrived here at today's point. You can talk about like last year's national strike and things that happened also before that, of other presidents and presidential candidates, and whatever you think were the important milestones that brought us here today.
Yeah, maybe I'll try to again present a little bit things that the context that is strikingly different from what some of our English speaking viewers in the global north might be used to. But that was, I believe, 1948 when Kaiten was assassinated, the presidential candidate who I guess was viewed as a possible progressive leftist. Well, I mean, he was attacked as being a communist by his detractors. And Gabriel Garcia Marquez wrote about that assassination in his autobiography quite at length. It just happened that Fidel Castro was there in Bogota on that day as well. And that assassination triggered what is called the Bogotasa, if I'm not mistaken, which reminds us a bit of the Caracasco in 1989, I believe it was. But the city was plunged into protests. The supposed assassin of Kaiten was basically killed in the streets by an angry mob. I guess people viewed that, you know, their democratic aspirations had been stolen from them, and a great repression followed, where the right wing of the Liberal Party, I suppose, kind of teamed up with the Conservative Party and repressed the population, and also sort of created a political pact whereby they ruled the country back and forth for about 40 years. It's very reminiscent of the pact in Venezuela that it was broken by Hugo Chavez in 1998. So I guess the guerrilla warfare began in earnest in the early 60s after the Cuban Revolution, where I guess the guerrillas sort of took some inspiration from Che and Castro's victories. At various times, there has been ceasefires. There was the 2016 ceasefire in Havana, which Shahili spoke a little bit about that and how, let's say, it hasn't really worked. But there was also the earlier one, at least one in the 1980s. I think there was actually two in the 1980s. During one of those, the leftist parties formed the Patriotic Union Party. So they sort of entered the political arena, forming a legitimate party, which really ended in mass murder and extermination of up to 5,000, but probably more likely 2,000 to 3,000 members of the Patriotic Union Party were assassinated, including 2 presidential candidates. And again, that's not ancient history, that's the 1980s. So that just puts in context. I know watching the presidential debates, you know, Hernandez didn't even show up for the presidential. He wasn't even there for the final debate. I don't know if he even participated in any of the debates personally. Yeah, okay. So I know for the final debate, he didn't show up.
Participate in at least 1 or 2, but there were several, and the one that he did participate in was November 7th, 2021. Gustavo Petro was not there, so maybe not as many people watched it, but it was a slate of right-wingers.
So you know, Gutierrez had basically accused Petro and his running mate of sort of manufacturing this story that you know, their lives were threatened, and you'll hear a lot of that perspective, sort of, I saw a lot of that on social media, people saying, oh, it's just a laser, anyone could have used a laser pointer and pointed it at the vice presidential candidate, which was what happened during one of her speeches, which created a big furor on stage, and they, surrounded her with bulletproof shields and everything. So for those people that are sort of like mocking this idea that the candidate's security is at risk, I think it's ridiculous to I mean, again, we have to keep in perspective the thousands of targeted assassinations of social leaders and multiple presidential candidates that have been murdered in Colombia over the last, I guess, 70 years, but even over the last 30 or 35 years. I wanted to cover maybe two really quickly, just the context of the current presidents, because I know a lot of people have asked me or are confused why Iván Duque is not running again. It is comparable to Ecuador, where Lenin Moreno, I believe, left with something like a 7% approval rating or whatever it was. Iván Duque's approval rating is very low, but he is not able to run again. But then people ask, well, how come Uribe was president for 8 years or whatnot? Just to put that in context, up until 2005, I believe it was, the Colombian constitution maintained that a president could only hold office for 1 4-year term and was not able to be reelected either consecutively or at any time afterwards. So Uribe won the presidency in 2002. During his first term in office, he, with the help of Juan Manuel Santos, who was his Minister of Defense, maybe he had held a different position with Uribe earlier, but in 2005, they changed this regulation and made it possible for Colombian presidents to be reelected to a second term. So Uribe was reelected in 2006. He held the presidency for 2 terms. He was the first Colombian president to do that. Perhaps, maybe way back it was possible, but I don't think so. I think he was actually the first Colombian president to hold office for 2 terms. Then Juan Manuel Santos, who had been Uribe's defense minister, parted ways with Uribe. Well, he was originally Uribe's candidate when he won the election, Santos, in 2010. So he became the another Uribista president in 2010, but quickly parted ways with Uribe. Uribe then went on to form another party because Santos had taken the party that was Uribe's, which was known as the U. So Uribe went on to form the Democratic Center Party to oppose Juan Manuel Santos. And I think he ran the candidate Suelega, maybe I'm pronouncing his name wrong, against Santos when Santos ran for a second term in 2014. Santos ended up winning a second term, so he became the second Colombian president to serve 2 terms. And then during Santos's second term, in order to prevent Uribe from running again for candidacy, Santos actually had these changes that he himself had lobbied for in 2005 to change the Colombian constitution, had these amendments struck down, I believe, as being unconstitutional, and basically reverted the law. By doing that, reverted the law back to where it had been before, which was that no Colombian president could either be reelected at any time or serve more than 1 4-year term. So that's how in the 2018 election, we got back to this situation where Duque served for 4 years as, again, the candidate of the Democratic Center, which was the party that Uribe had formed in 2013 to oppose Santos. So given that context of this back and forth for numerous elections between the party of Uribismo and the splinter party that had formed from the original Uribismo party, given that context, it's a huge deal that Gustavo Petro is going to be advancing to the second round with a majority. He was there again in 2018, advancing into the second round, although at that time, it was Duque that had won the first round quite handily. Anyways, anyone could go on and on and on forever with all these changing parties and coalitions in Colombia. It's nothing like we're used to in the US or Canada, where you essentially have two parties that have the exact same name, that stand for the same thing, that go at it year after year after year. In Colombia, it's much more complicated than that. It's very complicated.
Okay, Steve, thanks a lot for the history, actually. And yes, when you mentioned that they had this term limit, a single term thing, that was signed long back, as you mentioned, during the first civil war after independence, when the conservatives and the liberals, they were quite different at the time. So when they were fighting a civil war and after peace was signed, that was the thing, that there will be no re-election or something like that. Of course, then I mean, there was this sort of thing that once there was a liberal president and then there was a conservative. So there was a pact, I believe, also at that time. I don't know like 200 years of history, but I think so. Anyway, so of all these things, like all these sort of things like violence and everything, the people who suffer the most are the common people. And there is extreme internal as well as external displacements in Colombia. And as far as I know, there are over 5 million Colombians living in Venezuela only. And there are many more who are living around the world. As like in this election itself, in 64 countries, people were voting for the presidential elections. And in many places, there are many people. Anyway, so Jesus, I will come to you and ask you about this displacement and how this thing affects everything, but also the situation of the elections in Colombia.
Yes, yes. Thank you, Sahili. And thank you, Steve, for the historical analysis of the elections that I didn't have it that clear until I hear you. Let me tell you. Even though we are in Venezuela, very familiar with things that happen in Colombia, but sometimes you get lost in, with all this, especially these legal details. But going back to the issue, I just want to mention, taking Sahili's word about the history of Colombia. We have in Venezuela this position about Santander and Bolivar. We see Santander was a hero of the independence, that was an important ally of Simon Bolivar during the independence war. But then he split with him, especially because he got embedded with power, and he was one of the engines behind the dissolution of what we call Gran Colombia, which is currently Panama, Venezuela, Colombia, Peru, Bolivia, and Ecuador. And and uh, and of course there were all the other active members of that divisionist movement, and not only Colombians. Santander was a Colombian figure, but then we have in Venezuela Páez, which was another important independence figure, but he also got in love with power. And we have Fuentes in Ecuador, which a lot of people believe that he's Ecuadorian, but he was actually Venezuelan. So I just want to mention that because we have this curse, some people call it, of division and conservatism. I don't know if the word exists in English, but what I'm trying to say is that affects Venezuela and the relations between our countries, but that also affects the internal dynamics within Colombia. And that take us, I want to jump from there to the assassination of Gaitan that was already mentioned by Steven Sahili. But And yes, I mean, that assassination is a breaking point in the political complexities of Colombia. And we measure the initiation of the civil war in Colombia with that date. I mean, I mean, with the assassination of Gaitan in 1948, I mean, 72 years have passed since that day, and Colombia haven't seen since that moment a moment of real peace, disregarding all the media campaigns that you can find here and there. And also, it is important to mention the assassination of Gaitan, that was a presidential candidate, as Steve was mentioning. I mean, it's not an isolated event. I mean, Colombian history has been marked since then with assassination of important political individuals, but also presidential candidates like Galan in the 80s, I believe. So I mean, there has been several incidents of political assassinations in Colombia, presidential candidates, and that's part of the analysis that we should also do. And we already mentioned that, but anyway, I just wanted to highlight that because it's not a joke. I mean, it's something that is a reality. I mean, that can be touched. So we have to pay attention to that more closely right now that we are entering in Colombia into the second round. And of course, this whole civil war environment was exacerbated with the guerrilla movement, especially in the 60s, as Steve mentioned, and that have divided Colombia since the 60s, especially because this guerrilla movement took real control of certain areas of Colombia. I mean, they operated like an alternate state within the state. And that also, in my opinion, is part of the problem with the current narco, guerrilla, paramilitary environment that we see currently in Colombia, because the way I see it, I mean, what we see right now is just the result of several decades of fragmentation of the country, of the state, of the Colombian state controlled by the oligarchy, not being able to reach certain areas that are under, first were under control of the guerrillas, and now are under control of paramilitary groups that are basically violent groups in arms supported by the army, the state, and the oligarchy, and also by the guerrilla or the mobilized guerrilla that they call right now. They have a name for them. I forgot. Disidencias. The dissident guerrillas. So basically, all those paramilitary, the mobilized guerrilla, most of them are embedded into the narco business that right now is part of the Colombian state. I mean, nothing in Colombia cannot pass through the lens of the narco traffic, because Colombia, everyone knows, has become the major drug producer in the world in terms of marijuana and cocaine, mostly. So it's a complex situation that have also implications in neighboring countries like Venezuela and Ecuador, for example, we have been suffering, and I know that we will talk about that later, but it has implication also in neighboring countries, but basically inside Colombia, and they mean that there's a lot of internal displacement, also displacement of Colombians moving to Venezuela or to other countries, just immigrating as the result of the violence. And of course, that's a very complicated reality that mainstream media usually do not talk about, but it's happening. It's not in the imagination of we in the left or in, I mean, those are facts that happen every day in Colombia. And I guess, I believe that Sahili or Steve mentioned that before, but I mean, we are talking right now about 44 massacres in 2022 alone, with 158 victims. That's according to In the Past, which is one of the best NGOs in Colombia measuring violence. And also members and signers of the peace agreement has been assassinated in 22 alone. Also, according to In the Past, those are very troubling figures. And I believe that Sahili mentioned the whole number, I mean, the total number since the signing of a peace agreement. But that's very important because the peace agreement that was very promoted by President Chavez when he was alive, and then President Maduro signed, was one of the signers of that peace agreement because Venezuela was one of the main engines behind that agreement. It's about, I mean, a lot of people say that it's almost lost because Colombia is going back to the same level of violence that we had during the Uribe presidency before the peace agreements, I mean. So it's a complex situation. It's not an easy situation. And I believe that, of course, that have a big effect on not only on the neighboring countries, but also all over the region. So I don't know what, that's it, basically.
Okay, so yes, the violence, I mean, Colombia unfortunately gets associated with so much violence, and that's really, really unfortunate. And like, well, those who like numbers, 321 signatories of peace agreements have been murdered since the signing of the agreements, and 245 during the time of Duque. And in addition to that, there were like 70 deaths during the national strike last year. So, I mean, just too many deaths behind this that are not really talked about. Too much displacement. When when anyone talks about immigration in the region, they talk about Venezuela without context. They do not mention Colombia and never provide the context either. And then Duque goes into the United Nations in the UN Security Council. He was there in March claiming that he has successfully implemented the peace agreements. And he said something about he wants peace without impunity or something like that. So we'll talk about it a bit later. But anyway, I will now come to Camila and ask something that's related. Since we have been talking about Gaitan and everyone, he was someone who promoted land reform, said that without land reform, there would be no peace in Colombia. So when, I mean, especially in the global north, I mean, I know people who would say, but how is it possible that there is racism in Colombia or something like that? Because they think Latino is a race and something like that. So I would ask you how this, I mean, why did Gaitan thought land reform is important? And Petro himself, as a senator, has said, like in speeches in the Senate many times, that he will implement a land reform because land reform is important for peace. So why is land reform so important, and how is the distribution of land, let us say, related to racism and classism in Colombia?
Well, it is the most important issue. It's difficult to argue that anything else is. It is literally just the root of all violence, of inequality, of the barriers to development, and like you said, all the discrimination, the racism, the anti-Indigenous racism, the removal of people from their lands. Everything is all based around land. And this is the same in every country. It's certainly the same in Venezuela. In November, we spoke to the director of the National Land Institute. We were able to interview him. I actually have a subtitled video here from some questions that I asked him that we never published. But one of the things he said, which goes the same for Colombia, is I was asking him in Venezuela, why is it so important to elect people from the Bolivarian government, from the PSUV, or communists and revolutionaries, to regional governments as mayors, as governors of Venezuelan states? And he said because the Venezuelan oligarchy who form the far-right parties, the right-wing parties, have the same project as the Colombian oligarchy. They want to come into power in the Venezuelan states to remove people from their land, and backpedal on all of the reforms that took place, and dispossess working class small producers and return 11 million hectares of land to 6 families. And he also said that when the right wing comes into power in a state, that the state, or the state, or in the case of other, I guess it would be a department in Colombia, experiences total abandonment. And within that abandonment, we see that vacuum of power, and we see the resurgence of paramilitaries and illegal activity and transnational organizations and crime. And that's the same for Venezuela under right-wing leadership, and Colombia. And in the case of Colombia, I mean, this is why the rural organizations have fought so hard to try to educate the bases and try to argue for an authentic, left-wing anti-imperialist government and for land reform, is because they know that these disputes and these tensions in the rural area are so central to these disputes, so central that even the right wing believes this in Colombia. And being that the case, in 2016, the peace accords, the first point of the peace accord is comprehensive agrarian reform. And the peace accords were not only signed by the, what people would consider to be the warring sides, which would be, the government of Juan Manuel Santos and the FARC, for example, but also signatories to the peace accord were these organizations of the rural areas, including the affiliates, members of the Colombia Campesina. And that's because, they know that the tensions in the rural area, will continue until these millions of hectares are parted out to small producers, so that they can produce our food, so that they can, produce not only for, Colombia in general, but also for the communities to be able to sustain themselves. And, as part of that, as part of the implementation of the peace accord, which we will, which we will only see under a Petro government, there are promises to further construct roads and highways and this sort of infrastructure to be able to get people's products to market to the cities, and also credit for to guarantee production, credit for small producers, small farmers, campesinos, but also specifically these sorts of programs for women, so that women can independently of husbands or any other title holders can start their own businesses. And this is really important for the reincorporation of rural peoples, not only former combatants and people who've had to in the last now 4 or 5 years reintegrate into regular civilian life, but also just people who've been excluded for so long. They not only will they be able to under new land reform produce for their own for their own selves and basic sustenance, but they also need to begin to do what other countries such as Nicaragua and Bolivia have done, which is create even more incentives and even more help from the state in order to help these producers transform food into more elaborate products, so that they're manufactured to eventually to even be exported, and that helps the national economy in ways that don't exist right now. So there's just countless reasons why this needs to be, why the peace accords and that those points having to do with land have to be implemented, and why this has been at the very root of so many of the demands made by those rural social movements. And it's important to say now that we're heading towards the Summit of the Americas in Los Angeles, that it continues to be the Ivan Duque government that is completely smitten by Joe Biden. Obviously, Colombia is not the only ally puppet state of the US, but it's actually, a very, extreme sort of case where we've seen Ivan Duque take several trips to the US in recent months, which is really bizarre. Obviously, all of the US puppets take trips to the US, but he's been meeting with, business lobbyists, with corporations, with all sorts of other groups, and obviously with, Biden and the high level authorities of the United States, but just, absolutely shamelessly, kissing up to the government, in his final months in office. And it's very obvious that he has sort of this ongoing PR campaign, and is like always coming on television and on social media bragging about all of the public works that he's done, which is really bizarre because he doesn't talk about the internal displacement that people suffer from in Colombia, and he doesn't talk about some of the most important things. While he's discussed multiple times, programs for youth, supposedly for young people, and things having to do with education, we know that that's absolutely not the case. The case is that even though Colombia is supposedly not supposed to be in an active war right now, that people continue to seek opportunities on the exterior, and that people continue to migrate. And this is a problem everywhere where the lack of democratization of land exists. Everywhere from Haiti to Paraguay to Guatemala and to Honduras. Hopefully that will change under this administration, and Colombia, that as long as rural people cannot get their own piece of land where they can live safely without threat from paramilitary and the cartels and clans, that the youth are going to either continue to seek some sort of opportunity living in poverty in the urban centers, or eventually migrating northward or outside. And this is because they don't have the means to live and produce on the land which, where they're from, and because in the city there don't exist significant opportunities within the given educational system. And there aren't economic, opportunities afterwards. So people continue to migrate outwards. That's nothing to brag about, and Duque continues to brag about it because he believes that his government will continue now under this Rodolfo Hernández. So I think it's very important to make that distinction that Gustavo Petro may not be the revolutionary that everyone wanted to see as presidential candidate of the left, and that this person has made lots of disparaging remarks and untrue remarks about Venezuela and Venezuela's Bolivarian government, and about other governments, including the revolutionary governments of Nicaragua and perhaps others. And that we might not see, eye to eye with him on everything, but at the same time, the grassroots movements have told us throughout this entire process that this is the only slate with the capacity to implement those peace accords and to, reverse some of the decisions made under Ivan Duque, which is, that sort of joining of a non-allied state of NATO, and to try to, change Colombia into, not to get into what you were going to say, but to pull out of this, this whole mercenary business and all the other, criminal things that we see that affect the wider region.
Of course. Yeah, and since you mentioned Nicaragua just now, I would say that if Petro really wants to implement land reform, he should take a look at Nicaragua and see how it has helped the poorest of the poor people there. And it has made it a food sovereign country, it has made it a leader in gender parity and whatnot. So that would be a good example for Petro if he wins, and if he wishes to, he has to implement land reform in order to bring about peace, at least in Colombia, if not anything else. So, since you had already started talking about the regional issues, I'd like to ask you all about all these things, that Colombia is a regional threat sort of in the region, as in it has US military bases, you mentioned it became a major non-NATO ally or something like that. And then it has had, of course, it has disputes with Venezuela, but it also has had recent, not recent, but a long-standing dispute, maritime dispute with Nicaragua. It has like many these sort of things. It has it was one of the main promoters of the Lima Group against Venezuela and all sorts of things. So I would ask first Jesus about the Colombia Venezuela relation at present and how all these things of the Colombian governments, one after the other, starting from Uribe, all their foreign policy, especially the hostile policy towards Venezuela, how does it affect Venezuela and what is the situation right now?
Thank you, Sahe. I mean, yes, it's absolutely a fact that, especially since the Guaido failed project began, Colombia became a major partner of Washington in their attempt to get rid of Maduro's government and the Bolivarian revolution. And there has been the closest ally and the one of the biggest destabilizing forces against Venezuela since then. I don't want to say that that didn't happen before, but since February 1919, when they invented this craziness about Juan Guaido, uh, Colombia took an active role in destabilizing Venezuela. And the first action that they took was the Cucutazo, as we call it now, which was this crazy force, crazy attempt, failed attempt to entry by force, so-called humanitarian aid to Venezuela. And that created security incidents, violence incidents in at least two the most important checkpoints, border checkpoints between Colombia and Venezuela in Táchira State, especially in Rubio and San Antonio. I'm talking about the Tienditas Bridge and the Simón Bolívar Bridge in Táchira State, and that was an evidence of the aggression of Colombia together with the US, because allegedly that humanitarian aid came from the US, from US aid. You can imagine how humanitarian that could be. So immediately that day, President Maduro took the decision of breaking relations with Colombia, diplomatic, political relations with Colombia. And that's something that I want to mention because these days, when we were a few days before the elections, a lot of people were talking about the Colombians in Venezuela that wanted to vote in Colombia, but were not able to do it because there were not consulates of Colombia here in Venezuela, and then blame Maduro for the decision without putting any context on the whole scene. And I read a lot of news pieces from mainstream media, and all of them say after Maduro took the decision of breaking relations with Colombia, the poor Colombians in Venezuela cannot vote anymore. And that's what they wrote. And that's why we decided to publish a piece a few days before the elections in Colombia, talking about the Colombians in Venezuela wanted to vote, and also mentioning that Venezuela, after that decision that was very fundamentada, was taken with a lot of, real grounds. Venezuela after that has been trying to repick the diplomatic and consular relations with Colombia, and it's the Colombian government the one that has been rejected the attempts to resume diplomatic relations with Venezuela, because that's part of their strategy to try to oust Venezuela, to try to follow the directions of Washington, and also to try to and they are stubborn also. I believe that Ivan Duque is a terrible statement, too stubborn to recognize that he committed a mistake. But anyway, I just wanted to mention that because that's one of the most recent, incidents that happened since 2019. But since 2019 until today, there has been zillions of incidents. I'm talking about military um, provocations from Colombia or from US forces operating in Colombia. Uh, and that takes me to the reality that we have in Colombia. I mean, a lot of people talk about the 7 military bases that the US have in Colombia, but the reality says that it is not only the 7 military bases. I mean, it's basically agreements that the Colombian signs with the gringos that allowed US military to operate mostly in any Colombian military base that they have in the country. But of course, people always talk about the 7 military bases, and they talk about the one in Cartagena, the one in Malambo, the one in Palenquero, Tolemaida, Bahia Malaga, Apply, and Larandia. Those are the 7 military bases that the US have in Colombia. And from those bases, they have launched um, surveillance, plane raids in the border with Venezuela. They have organized military drills. The last one a few months ago with the presence of a nuclear U.S. submarine. And they have also not recently, a few days ago, was approved in the U.S. the recognition of Colombia as a special non-NATO ally of the U.S., which gives Colombia this, special treatment with the U.S. I don't know how much special it could be. I mean, I believe that that's already the signing of a marital relation. But anyway, make it
Jesus,
very
okay.
yes.
Something happened with your sound, but we can hear you now.
Okay, yes, I have a sign here that the connection is unstable. I don't know why. But anyway, if I go down, please keep talking, and my internet might be bumpy right now. But anyway, what I wanted to mention is that all these facts, yes, I mean, are like the ground for the U.S. Interventions towards Venezuela, and within that framework, we can talk about Colombia training mercenaries to go into Venezuela, uh, and actually launching a mercenary operation against Venezuela, the one that is called Operación Gedeón, which was an attempt by sea to send paramilitaries, mercenaries from Colombia, including gringos mercenaries, to oust or kill President Nicolás Maduro and top-ranked Chavista officials. That happened in 2020, if I recall well. May 2020, just 1 year or a little bit more than a year after the Guaido self-proclamation, and that attempt was, destroyed by the people of Venezuela, which is something very amazing, by the militias and the security forces, and that shows very clearly how rooted the Bolivarian revolution is with the people, and how deep is the connection between the people and the Bolivarian revolution in something that we call here in Venezuela the civic military union, which is key for the survival of the Bolivarian revolution, especially in recent years. So, I mean, there are tons of more incidents that have happened in recent years of the stabilization. Last year we had this a lot of incidents with paramilitary narco terrorist group from Colombia in Apure state, and that created crashes between our National Guard and the paramilitary groups that control that part of Arauca in Colombia that borders with Apure state in Venezuela, and that are trying to bring into Venezuela all the craziness operations that they do in Colombia. And it's complicated to stop that, because I mean that border is very wide and there are a lot of connection points. I mean we are the same country. I mean, a lot of people, even people from the left, have in Colombia or in Venezuela have this chauvinistic approach toward, patrioterismo, we call it here. I mean, like leader patriotism, in which Colombians have to be enemies of Venezuelans and Venezuelans have to be enemies of Colombia. Something that I don't know who invented it, but I believe that as part of the imperial approach towards, division of the continent, something that is in the opposite of Bolivar approach towards unity. So I believe that anyone that supports the Bolivarian project, that calls himself or herself a leftist or socialist, cannot have that kind of sentiments. In this particular case, I mean, I'm talking about Venezuelans against Colombians or Colombians against Venezuela. And I mentioned that because that sometimes is part of the problem between the two countries. It's something very rooted in history that might take us back to Santander and Bolivar. But anyway, I will stop here because I already have talked too much. But I just, before changing before stopping, I just want to mention the Nicaragua issue, which is another important, I mean, the territorial dispute that is happening between Colombia and Nicaragua that I'm sure is going to have a big impact in the coming years. Especially, of course, that will depend on the results of the elections, and also the fact that the US, I mean, the Colombian regional threat is not only affecting Venezuela. I mean, the Uribe bombed Ecuador to kill the FARC leader Manuel Marulanda in the 90s. I mean, no, in the early 2000s. So I believe, I'm not sure, I don't remember exactly the year, but I believe that is 2007, 2008, something like that. And that created a big political dispute, I mean, problem between Colombia, Venezuela, and Ecuador. And we have the participation of Colombia in the assassination of Moise in Haiti. So, I mean, Colombia has become an exporter of violence in the region, an exporter of destabilization in the region, and that should be addressed. So that's it.
Okay, Jesus, yes, thank you. And if we, I mean, nobody talked much about it, but if we are, I mean, if I think, of course, the death did happen. So Jesus Santrich was killed in Venezuela by Colombian mercenaries or paramilitaries or who knows. So that is also another act of violence, and nobody talked much about that after it happened. Even the Colombian government didn't talk much about that. Why, I don't know. But anyway, since it's not known much. But yeah, since Jesus mentioned two things, he mentioned Nicaragua and he mentioned Haiti. So I will come to Camila and ask you to give us a broader regional view. I know you go to Nicaragua a lot. You have connections in Central America. So, like, what is this problem that that Nicaragua and Venezuela have? Sorry, Nicaragua and Colombia have. It's not a territorial dispute in the sense, but it's a maritime dispute with sea borders and stuff like that. As much as I understood. So, what sort of problem is that? And like also, if you will talk about how the Colombian paramilitarism and narco trafficking affects the entire region, not just Venezuela, but everybody around.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many, it's this election is so important for the entire region, for all the connections that have been mentioned by you all. But I mean, I really have to stress the way in which the conflict and the constant warring and violence, the paramilitaries and everything have affected Ecuador. Ecuador has changed virtually overnight. President Rafael Correa left power in May of 2017 when Lenin Moreno took power. And, just probably about 6 to 12 months later, it was a completely changed country. And now we're seeing, massacres in the prisons. We're seeing a lot of transnational crime taking place in Ecuador. But even during those first years of the Lenin Moreno administration, of course, now Guillermo Lasso is president, but it's kind of a continuation. They're the same right-wing forces. But, we saw kidnappings near the Colombian-Ecuadorian border by these cartels of civilians. We saw executions, including three journalists from a very important, probably the most important right-wing and largest network, one of the largest networks in Ecuador, El Comercio. They were taken by a cartel and held hostage and eventually killed and never returned home. This dominated the headlines, but many other, within Ecuador, of course, but many other things have taken place which haven't dominated the headlines within Ecuador or in the region. People haven't seen the way in which this has affected the border regions of the bordering countries, namely Venezuela and Ecuador. Obviously, the story has been the opposite, the story that Washington and its think tanks and its media outlets and the CIA, of course, have pushed, have been that, Venezuela represents a threat to the rest of the region, when in fact it's Colombia that represents a threat. Not only were those mercenaries involved in the killing of the former president of Haiti, but they came here to La Paz, where I am right now. They came here to the Hotel Presidente, it's called, during right before the inauguration of President Luis Arce in November of 2020, because these mercenaries from Colombia, Colombian mercenaries, were to be contracted by Janine Áñez's former defense minister. Now he is a fugitive in Brazil currently, escaping Bolivian justice for the crimes he committed against the coup. But he and others from the far right of the Bolivian political sectors tried to prevent Luis Arce and the MAS from regaining power. And they did so knowing they could contract hitmen from Colombia. That's absolutely something that we've seen all around the world and is really frightening. I think, so mercenaries have been something that since 2017, when we began to see all of these, accelerating destabilization actions from the US against Venezuela, Ambassador Permanent Representative to the UN, Samuel Moncada, has been one of the best people denouncing and explaining to the world what the situation has been in Venezuela and the threats that we really face. And just last week in the National Assembly of Venezuela, Samuel Moncada laid out the many ways in which the United States has largely admitted through different functionaries of the Biden and Trump administration, all the different destabilization, coup, and assassination attempts against Venezuela. And if you go down the list of these 20 different attempts that he lists, so many of them have to do with Colombia or were based in Colombia. They were attacks that were being waged on Venezuela, as the ones Jesus mentioned, such as these paramilitaries on the border, who are working with the Colombian government in order to destabilize that whole porous, large border area, and different things like this. And this is something that over time, on various instances, the Venezuelan National Assembly and other high functionaries of the President Maduro's administration have said that they're going to seek answers. They've demanded answers from Bogota, asking why it is that they're involved in these, what amounts to, just one step before a direct military intervention, though we've not necessarily seen what constitutes a direct military intervention in Venezuela from the US or Colombia. We've seen something just before that, which is paramilitaries who work with the DEA and work with the US, and US mercenaries working with Colombian and Venezuelan mercenaries trying to enter Venezuelan territory. So this is, of course, something that will only be addressed, only has the possibility of being addressed under a Petro government. One thing I think is really, let me just turn this heater on, it's very loud. One thing that I think is very, a question that I have, or, a point that I think could be developed on a little bit, is just the parallels between the peace process in Colombia and the process of the peace accords in El Salvador of 1992, and the way in which we had this whole gap of time where the FMLN demobilized as a guerrilla force and turned into a political party. And it was a very popular political party until they finally came to the presidency. And they've been able to elect, obviously, people on all levels of government, mayors, departmental governors, and National Assembly members. Sorry, I think in Spanglish, but and also Sanchez Cerén was actually the second president of the FMLN to come to power. Unfortunately, they lost power and have lost a little bit of support and relevance, we would say. But I guess one of the questions that I think would be very important to ask going forward, or to even ask right now in this electoral process, is what kind of maybe one of you have something to say about this, is what kind of influence and impact the Comunes party has had on this election and this electoral process, because all of them have essentially voiced their support for Gustavo Petro as the only way to progress and advance in the peace accords implementation and to have a country of peace and to turn the page from Uribismo. But unfortunately, this party that has such a good ideology and such a good understanding and analysis of the situation doesn't have the sort of relevance that you would, hope that it would have to be able to someday soon arrive to, to the presidency in the way that FMLN did. And so I think that just for us as Kawsachun News, those Comunes party leaders, politicians, the elected leaders, and those former combatants are a reference for us editorially in terms of, what we should be looking for in terms of the policies that Petro is proposing, and, in terms of, they'll be very important, hopefully, in pushing for these changes if Petro becomes elected.
Okay, yeah, thank you. And that's an important thing that you mentioned, FMLN, and that all that their peace treaty. This has been 30 years of the peace treaty, and the country is not really that much at peace, I think. I mean, of course, there isn't a civil war going on, but there is there could be an entire discussion about the present government and the present president, which we are not doing here, but we could do it at some other time. So I've just come to Steve and ask you, how do people in the North view all these things? Like, how do they view the situation, the influence of Colombia in the region, and also how do they influence Colombia? I mean, both Jesus and Camila have addressed the thing about it being a NATO ally, Colombia being a non-NATO ally or something like that, it being basically a de facto US colony in the region. But not many people think about Canada when they talk about Colombia. So could you expand on this? This will be the last thing we'll discuss before we take some of the questions from those who are listening. So they have two questions, and I think I can add another and end it. So yeah, Steve, a view from Canada, or how Canada influences, or how Colombia influences the North, etc., or how people in the North see these things.
Yeah, there's so many interesting things to speak about. Thanks, by the way, to everyone tuning in and to everyone on this panel up to now. It's been a great pleasure. I just wanted to clarify before I get into that one thing, which was that it was Raul Reyes who was killed by Colombia in 2008 in Ecuador. He was the FARC guerrilla that was bombed with US-made smart bombs in Ecuador by the Colombian Air Force. Marulanda, I think, died that same year, but it wasn't that actual incident. As far as what people in the West or North America, Canada and the US English-speaking countries know about Colombia, I will just speak for my own experience, which is, I've always been interested in history, political science. I went to a good university. I learned almost nothing about Colombia beyond Gabriel Garcia Marquez and cocaine and the FARC. Those are the things that we know mostly about Colombia. We don't learn all that much, and we certainly don't learn about the presence of US military bases in Colombia or the imperialist, let's say, factors in South and Central America that dominate the politics of various countries, the geopolitics too. As far as Colombia's relationship with the U.S. and with NATO, this was just, I think, last week or the last couple of weeks that this non-NATO ally status was formalized. I think in March, actually, it was determined that they would become a non-NATO ally. They join 20 other or about 20 other countries and entities with this status. They're actually not the first in South America or Latin America. They were the first, I believe, to be named a NATO partner, which I think was in the year 2002, and they were named a NATO global partner or something like this. A major non-NATO ally is a different designation that's provided to various countries that certain dictatorships already have this. In South America, Argentina and Brazil, very recently, Brazil was designated as one by Trump in 2019. But other countries that have this status include Bahrain, which is essentially a dictatorship, the apartheid state, Egypt, as well as a host of other basically US vassal states, including Taiwan, not even recognized as a country by the US. So it's a strange status. To me, it's very significant and very bizarre, as Camila has been pointing out. It's very bizarre that Duque visited the US numerous times, and then that this status was convoked upon Colombia and made official just a few days before the election. It's really strange. For maybe, I think I would like to draw a parallel while we're talking about NATO and the military partnerships and the elections. I would like to draw a very loose parallel, but maybe to make it easier for people to understand, with Ukraine. Everyone's learned a lot about Ukraine over the last few months, obviously. We're all very familiar now with the idea that there is a fascist paramilitary organization in Ukraine, the Azov Battalion, which was incorporated into the Ukrainian army in 2014 after the fascist-supported Maidan or Euromaidan coup. Now, I'm not saying in any way Colombia is not the same as Ukraine, but there are a lot of parallels that become easier and easier to understand as people have been learning about the massive amounts of billions of dollars that NATO and particularly the US has been funding, throwing into the Ukraine conflict now. They've done very much the same thing over the years with Colombia. With Plan Colombia, which ran for 15 or 17 years, The US threw in billions and billions of dollars, hundreds of billions of dollars every year into the Colombian military. They said it was going to go to social programs or whatnot. 70 to 80% of these billions, I think $6 billion at least over those 17 years, went directly to the Colombian military. In some years, 97% of the funding from Plan Colombia went into the Colombian military. One of the key architects and supporters of Plan Colombia was Joe Biden when he was in the US Senate in 2000. Just as in the Ukraine, the key, Biden was, I believe, the vice president at that time of Obama. So these people were very much involved in the destabilization of Ukraine and in the subsequent funding of these far-right fascist organizations that now wield a certain amount of power in Ukraine, just like in Colombia. I think it's really interesting in Ukraine that many people now have heard or familiar with the idea that Zelensky received death threats and has been intimidated at every turn by these far-right groups who have essentially a small amount of political support, but because of the incredible violence and the very real threats of killings, it forces politicians to make certain decisions. I think in Colombia, you've got very much a similar type of situation. And it means that if Gustavo Petro were to come into power, it's unclear how much he would be able to do. What is very clear is that any politician like Petro or social activists, socialists, they face the fear of assassination, the very real fear that they'll be killed in Colombia. And I mean, I can't emphasize that enough, how, as Camila has also, how scary that is and how much bravery and courage it takes for anyone in Colombia to speak out against this military fascist regime that's heavily funded by the US. These paramilitary organizations in Colombia are fascists. They're racist, fascist organizations, sometimes with ties to Hitler and Franco specifically's fascism. After all, Colombia was a close ally of Franco Spain for many years, and you'll see the symbology of the fascist and phalangist movements reflected in the Colombian paramilitary organizations. The attacks that they and by the way, just if anyone's unclear, also the paramilitary and the military in Colombia are very closely aligned. This has been very well documented over the years. When I first learned about the conflict in Colombia, I learned about it as if there were three separate actors: the paramilitaries, the guerrillas, and the government. But once you learn a little bit more, it's very clear that the paramilitary is essentially, again, like the Azov battalion in Ukraine, which has now been incorporated into the military. But the paramilitaries are essentially a fascist, ultra-violent wing of the government that has allowed the government and the military to commit far greater atrocities and crimes than they ever would have been able to, with a level of plausible deniability that's particularly important for the US, by occasionally extraditing paramilitary leaders, by encouraging the government to prosecute paramilitaries for massacres and narco trafficking every once in a while. The US is able to preserve a sort of veneer of let's say justice or aid. That they can therefore justify that these billions of dollars that they've given to Colombia are actually there to fight narco trafficking. Whereas on the other hand, the narcotic industry in Colombia just keeps growing and growing and growing. So like I said, I could go on and on about these parallels and about the implications for the region as far as what Colombia is. But I think for people that are more familiar with Ukraine, imagine Colombia and with Brazil on the other side as another non-NATO ally, as countries that are encircling Venezuela, where the revolutionary program of the Bolivarian government has been in place since 1999. They're encircling it, and their goal is to destabilize it in every possible way. So I'll stop there. I could go on and on about this, obviously.
Oh, no, okay, thank you, because like lots, as you said, in the last 2-3 months, we have heard a lot about Ukraine, so a lot of people could draw the parallels easily. That's why it also. Thank you for mentioning that. Yes, in Colombia, like government, military, paramilitary, economy are not really very different, because in like I have heard Colombians saying, like calling, like not just paramilitary, there is also a term called parapolitics, like relation between the paramilitary and the political oligarchy, and also para economy, which is like the relation between the economic oligarchy and the economic elite with the paramilitary, and that the paramilitary forces are actually like quite close, or let's say they are paid, armed, everything by multinational corporations to steal land, or at least to displace people from their lands, so that they can have it. And so they're like basically they're colonizing the country, not just militarily but also territorially. And these corporations, if you look at who is which corporations these are, most of these will be from Canada, and they're mining corporations, but many are also energy corporations from Canada, US, and Spain. So yeah, that's something to keep in mind, that this sort of model, Colombia is called a democratic model or what's not by many mainstream media in the north. And this is the sort of democratic model that they wish to impose on Venezuela also. This is the spreading democracy. Anyway, so there is also this thing which has been mentioned by both Camila and Steve, that Duque had visited many times the US just before the elections. From January to March, he had visited many times, even last year, also the late last year. So there was also these speculations that he might be looking for, like lobbying for a post in probably the UN or probably some other multilateral organization like that. So he is trying to like, not he is lobbying so that his image gets whitewashed, and like his poll ratings are terrible. I mean, his ratings in the country are terrible. So in the international field, he will be whitewashed and presented as maybe an ambassador for peace, or even the, who knows, UN Human Rights Commissioner or something like that. Hopefully that does not happen, because that will be the greatest, I don't know, tragicomedy, hypocrisy. But yeah, let's see what happens to that. So now, there are 2 questions from the audience, and we should be asking them. And after that, I will have another question, and then we'll wrap it up, because we are already past our mark, and we'll be here all day and night. Anyway, so this is from our friend Arnold August. Arnold, I mean, everybody knows he is a peace activist, very famous. So he asks, it's particularly for Camila, and he says that it would be better for Petro, should he win, to ally with the left and social movement who would have helped him win, rather than the type of rainbow coalition following like the presidents of Peru and especially Boric of Chile, where their popularities are dropping compared to the popularity of Luis Arce in Bolivia, which is increasing. And we know Luis Arce has kept very close to the grassroots, and it's not like a rainbow type of thing. On the other hand, Boric, uh, I won't say Pedro Castillo is similar to Boric, but yeah, it will be Camila to talk about this thing, like how Petro should be more like how would it help Petro if he is more like Arce than like Boric, for example?
Yeah, I think with the result that we saw on Sunday night, he'll be looking to the right, inevitably. He'll be looking, I mean, on the one hand, he'll look to some of those small candidates who obviously are out of the race now, but they received very little vote. But he will be looking to other, other right-wing politicians who can potentially, who he considers to be centrist, to lend their support to him publicly, to get that endorsement, to try to get other people to vote for him. And by, the way in which he'll appeal to them is, of course, by offering them positions within his administration. And apart from that, his strategy, or their strategy for the Pacto Histórico will be to use Francia Marquez, the vice presidential candidate, in order to get some of the people who might not have voted to be participating in these elections. That would be like, youth sectors, more Afro and indigenous sectors from the rural area, because of course, they don't want this slate to look as if it's too academic or middle class or too Bogota centered or anything like that. So they're going to be trying to, really use her, because the thing is, he has gained an immense amount of votes, if we believe that these votes are accurate and the electoral system is sound, since the previous election that he ran in. And so, it's very difficult to see where else there is for him to gain more votes. And so they're really going to need to use, Francia, as well as people such as this former vice presidential candidate, Luis Gilberto Murillo, who was with Sergio Fajardo, who has also lent his support, and people like that from different, the regions that are more rural, to try to get their support as well. I think it's very unlikely that he's going to just stick to the left when he sees what the prospects are, given that they performed under what some of the polls had predicted. But I think that regardless, if he is able to come to power and govern, I think there are different ways of seeing it. There's no chance that a Gustavo Petro Colombia is going to join ALBA TCP. And that's not necessary. It's not necessary for anyone to be some sort of revolutionary or join ALBA TCP in order to have amicable relations with countries of the region and to be able to make some changes. And so, right now, Colombia has, fairly good relations with Bolivia, for example, because it's a member of the Andean community. It's also a member of Mercosur and CELAC. And, this is really important in the case of Bolivia. We've seen, Bolivia has very good relations with Peru and, with Chile and Argentina and Colombia and Ecuador. And this is extremely important because it means that we have, nearby markets to sell Bolivian products. We have places, where we can buy things without having to import them overseas. And, some of the, what we should be thinking about in terms of like the wider region is not only, who is going to facilitate this socialist ideal scenario, but just very basic things such as like, what are some of the shortages and hardships that we're facing right now as consequence of the conflict? What are some of the things that we've had to import from overseas for so many years? What can we be producing here and trading here in our local region? And trying to strengthen these relationships and help each other out. In the case of Bolivia, of course, it's because Castillo has come into power, who has been a government that has been hijacked by the right and attacked by the right, that Bolivia has been able to gain access to a port, and able to access the sea in order to sell, the products overseas and to send our products outwards. That massively helps the Bolivian economy, and deals like that. But also, just being able to sell, gas products and, wheat and other things to the neighbors would be very important. And so these are some of the, improvements we can see to, our region, to strengthen the region economically, if we have Petro back in power. But I just wanted to say, because I think you asked earlier and I kind of forgot to answer about, the effects of, paramilitarism and the violence and the drug situation in this narco state, Colombia, on Afro-descendant and indigenous people. And I think it's really important that, as we've spoken about Plan Colombia and the damage that it has done to the entire state and how we can attribute, the ongoing massacres and killings of social leaders and Afro and indigenous descendant people throughout Colombia, that, the way in which this is going to change is for a new government to come in to Bogota and begin over time, because it's going to take decades, begin the process of changing the institutions, changing, the way of governance, so that the programs that are being implemented as part of an anti-drug strategy, first of all, it has to be a nationalized anti-drug strategy, as we see in Bolivia. We cannot continue to take, a prescribed or imposed strategy from Washington and these, DEA and US advisors to the Colombian military and police. And it's only through changing that strategy of how to deal with crime and violence and the drug problem that we're ever going to see a decline in, apart from the implementation of the peace accords and those points, that the overall these policies have to change in order to see a more humane treatment of these problems, because the ideology behind them is so screwed up. This same ideology, in terms of the way in which we combat crime and violence and gangs and cartels, when it's implemented in any country of Latin America and the Caribbean, it always involves brutality and excessive use of state force and killings against the most vulnerable people. And in all countries, whether it's Honduras or Mexico or Colombia, the people who are at the receiving end of that are largely, indigenous people, and in populations where there are Afro-descendant people, those people as well end up being killed. And they're a large part of those figures that we have of the massacres and the killings of rural people.
Okay, so thanks for answering, and I think Arnold has got more than what he asked for. Now I will come to Steve and ask a question that Yuri has asked. Since I am asking you this because you mentioned Plan Colombia. So, Plan Colombia is not just about it. It talked about social programs, and part of it was to like to decrease drug production and consumption, but it has had the opposite effect. So, like, what has been this drug war in Colombia, and if Petro wins, what should be like? What should it do to end the drug war? Because it is also something that has killed people, and it's not like people just have a mental health problem or health problem that they go on consuming cocaine or something or producing a lot of it is because they are under threats, or they are poor and they cannot do anything else to earn money. So how do you think should a drug war be ended? Like, how can drug wars be ended in Colombia?
That's a really difficult, a very difficult question to answer. For me, obviously, I don't have. I think I don't have the answer. I think Camila did touch a little bit, maybe on the idea of a perspective and a culture that right now is, being imported from the U.S. Drug Enforcement Agency, the DEA. And that's obviously a failed strategy of how to combat drug problems. It's not working in the US. It results in the mass incarceration of Black and Latin Americans in the US, and in increased violence, corruption, gang warfare with killings. I was having this conversation the other day with a friend of mine, and she brought up Portugal, which has recently legalized all recreational drugs, I guess you would call it. And I don't know too much about how successful it's been, but it's a different perspective where, when someone is found with drugs, let's say cocaine, heroin, or whatnot, then they're going to try to help them out a little bit, provide social programs to them. They're going to view it as an illness instead of a crime. And maybe that would be one of the first steps to changing the culture and the failures of Colombia's war on drugs. I think it would have to be connected, or it would have to be linked to a delinking or a disconnecting from the US policy. Another thing I think it's important to remember is, I mean, these drugs are this cocaine is being consumed by the US. This problem is not a problem of mass consumption. I mean, of course, there's consumption of illegal drugs in Colombia, but this is an imperialist situation where you have the US as the greatest consumer of cocaine in the world, using one of its vassal states as a export cocaine based economy. So I think that's an important link also. There's like strange and interesting comparisons with Venezuela that I was thinking of too, where we know Venezuela is very dependent on the export of oil, and at the same time, a lot of eco-socialists and environmentalists attack oil as being fossil fuels as being a harmful product. In the same way, cocaine is a harmful product in a lot of ways, but the people of Colombia, many people in Colombia, depend on the profits from drug trafficking in order to live, and they're not all paramilitary murderers. Some of them, a lot of them, are just everyday people, vulnerable people living in rural areas and whatnot. So there is that to remember too, especially if you consider the context of Bolivia, where Evo Morales comes from, the coca growers organizations of Bolivia, and maybe Camila could speak more about that. But and maybe Bolivia also provides the best solution and the most similar situation when we're going to look at how Colombia could approach this problem.
Yeah, that's a good answer. I mean, of course, that it is the US that's the biggest problem, because because of the US that there are people growing, not I mean, growing coca is not a crime. I mean, should not be a crime. And actually, it is these drugs. I always talk about this, that it is these drugs that have criminalized the very ancient products that people used to produce, like both coca and poppy, have been very criminalized because of their potentials to be used as harmful drugs. Although both of these things are actually like thousands of years old. They have been used in different cultures, and they have been consumed in foods and drinks that really don't harm people. I mean, I eat poppy seeds in food, so it's not really something terrible or anything. But yeah, opium is. And I think that one could also have looked at Afghanistan during the socialist period, or let's say, okay, socialist period, let's say, especially when Taraki was the president. He tried to replace it. There was also the question of land comes in here, because in Afghanistan also, most of the producing lands were owned by a few families, few elite families, and they had serfs, farmers who were sort of bonded laborers, and they were the ones that were growing the opium. Like, they were forced to do it, and these elite people were sending it overseas to Europe and to the US. It still continues thanks to the US destroying Afghanistan. But anyway, so at the time, I think President Taraki went to the UN. It could be UN Food Program or some other organization, from which he asked for loans so that this opium production, I'm sorry, poppy production could be reduced, because it was being produced at a level for which drug could be produced and not just as food. So that these areas, poppy growing areas, could be reduced, and it could produce food that people could eat, fruits and wheat and stuff like that. He was killed by his own military, like it was a military coup against him, and he was killed by his own military because of this, because there is so much oligarchic interest also, as well as imperialist interest in these things. So it's really a very difficult question to end drug wars. But of course, the main thing that should be done is to stop militarizing countries in order to be able to stop this sort of wars, and then providing people with social programs and other outlets, other ways to do things so that they can come out of that those things, because they are, like Steve said, they are not murderers, they are not criminals. Either they're very poor or they are under threat to do these things, or both. So, and I mean, in Mexico also, since no, sorry, Yuri mentioned Mexico. In Mexico, there has been recently this program called Sembrando Vida, which is trying to um, take people out of producing poppy and produce either like a fruit or wood producing trees, so that it's both a reforestation program as well as a food production program. And they're trying to do this in Central America also, like in the recent tour that AMLO, the president of Mexico, made in Central American countries. He promoted this program, and I think both Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador will be, and Belize, let's mention, they will be joining this program, so that well, it should also depend on the will of the governments, but anyway, so that people can come out of producing drugs and start producing food, because people need food to eat. You cannot just go on importing things, because you'll also be importing inflation if you go on importing food. So this is a very, very long thing. We'll be here all all day or all night, like I said. So anyway, I have one question, and then I think we should wrap it up, and anyone can answer. I mean, Jesus talked about the military bases of the US in Colombia, as well as the entire militarization of the country. So I think I will go to him and ask, what do you think will happen to these military bases if Petro wins? Like, you can compare with other countries that has had military bases and then had progressive governments. So what can possibly be done? Because I know, I mean, I haven't read the entire constitution of Colombia, but as far as I know, the constitution of Colombia does not really allow the establishment of foreign military bases in its territory. And still there are 7 US military bases, apart from US military being everywhere or training. So what is it like? How is it possible? How is such an unconstitutional, illegal thing possible? And how can anyone end this thing?
Yes, yes, it's a complex situation, but not so complicated to solve, if you ask me. But I just want to touch a little bit the last question that Yuri asked about the how to get rid of the drug culture, and it's not an easy answer. I mean, it's not. You already said, but I want to emphasize that it's not an easy answer because it's a cultural thing. Sometimes maybe from afar might see it like, you will close this, open that, and switch some buttons and the scene will disappear. But the reality is that it's a cultural thing that get too deep into the culture, into the territory, into the land, that is not something easy to solve. I mean, I believe that Sahili mentioned it at the beginning, but I mean, it will take decades to solve this kind of problems because, or it was Camila, I believe, because of what I'm saying. I mean, it's very complicated to solve the drug culture, especially in Colombia, where the territory has been seized by paramilitary and drug gangs, and that seize means that they connect with the communities, they stress the communities, they try to buy the communities, they get in. I mean, they get into the schools. I mean, it's not like you pass a switch and the scene will disappear. It's like a very complicated issue to solve. But of course, there should be solutions and there should be first step to take, and that's what Steve and Camila talk about. So I believe that we should move into that direction, of course. And going back to your question, Sahi, I believe that you should. I mean, Colombia's government has been bypassing the constitution to try to get these military agreements with Colombia because of, as you say, the constitution do not allow what is happening in Colombia, but they have been taking executive actions in order to make it happen, bypassing the constitution. And of course, that's illegal. That, I mean, that's very questionable. I mean, there should be more resources within Colombia trying to get rid of that. But how can you do that in a country that is controlled by the US first and then by the paramilitary and drug cartels? It's going to be very complicated because, I mean, the drug business and the interests of the US and the Colombian oligarchy are embedded into all levels of the state in Colombia. But if, for example, a progressive guy like Petro, that if he really wants to change something, he could try to get rid of those executives, because it's going to be easier for Petro to undo these executive agreements with the US, because it's not something that he's going to have to pass through Congress or something like that. You know what I mean? So I believe that it's going to be easier for him to do it. The problem is how he will face the factual powers within Colombia to make it happen. How will, you know, be able to face the army, the US government? So it's not an easy solution, but I believe that can be started. Ecuador did it during the times of Correa. I mean, they get rid of the military base in Manta. I believe. I'm not sure the status of that, but I'm pretty sure that at least during the Correa's time, they advanced towards that direction. And I'm not sure about Bolivia, but anyway, I believe that will be my answer.
Yeah.
And so, sorry, just me add something. I'm very happy because we have people, I mean, we have Camila from Bolivia, we have Sahili from India, Steve from Canada, and of course me, that I'm in Caracas, and I love to have these conversations with people from different parts of the world. Sorry, Camila.
No, just to say that in the case of Ecuador, towards the end of Lenin Moreno's administration and now under Lasso, they are allowing the US to come up and set up its bases once again. So unfortunately, all of those advancements under the Rafael Correa administration are now being undone.
That's a big problem, like everywhere. Like the moment you have the return of the right wing, it's like it's like this, that it is the right that talks of democracy, or at least calls all leftist forces dictatorial and authoritarian, but the moment they come, they start doing dictatorial and authoritarian stuff. So on the other hand, in case of like progressive governments, they try to do things like pass things through Congress, go through a lot of consultations, through referendums and whatnot, in order to like pass any order or approve anything. On the other hand, like you don't really have a democratic right in Latin America. All the right wing in Latin America is authoritarian. This is what I wanted to say. And the one in Colombia is terribly authoritarian, apart from being fascist. So thanks a lot to Camila and to Steve, and of course Jesus, for all these things. And Camila, thanks once again for joining us. And we'll also, of course, have you again in future for other stuff. And thanks a lot to everyone who has been watching on Facebook. Thanks to both Arnold and Yuri who asked questions. Like, we are friends with all of them. So thanks a lot to you all. Good evening, good night. Let's end
Thank you
this.
so much, guys. Nice speaking with you.
Thank you.
We'll catch you next time.